Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You've heard from the e-infrastructures in terms of grids, and you've heard from e-infrastructures in terms of high-performance computing. I want now this afternoon to look briefly at the networking aspects of e-infrastructures, because ultimately the ability to cooperate on a national, on an international, and on a global level requires good networking to support that capability. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the Pan-European Research and Education Networking, GÉANT. GÉANT is, as you can see from this picture, a pan-European network. It has got a very resilient infrastructure. The design of the network has been such that it minimizes single points of failure, maximizes diversity in terms of connectivity, to create what is, for all practical intents and purposes, both a very high-performance infrastructure, but also a very reliable infrastructure as well. In terms of the network, it has a centralized operation, so it takes advantage of the federalized structure of the pan-European network and the National Research Network, but the glue is in terms of an overall centralized operation that provides for ownership of problems. And it has a common governance of the research networks that make up the cooperation which is part of GÉANT. So it's a very good example of European cooperation at both a national and a pan-European level. Looking at it a little bit more in figures, I think Mario Campolago somewhat stole my thunder on this, but effectively, if you count the number of people connected to the national networks, then you get in excess of 40 million potential users. Those consist of, obviously, the very basic student users, but also some very sophisticated, very advanced and demanding users. In addition, if you look at the connected institutions, there are over 8,000 of them. So from all practical intents and purposes, it has an impressive pan-European coverage. There are 40 countries connected in Europe, and also there is a global dimension, which I'll consider in a second. If you look at roughly speaking, the cost of something like this, then GÉANT is co-funded by a commission contract of 93 million euros, which runs for a period of about 4 years. So you're talking about an annual run rate in excess of 40 million euros a year to provide this pan-European capability. And in terms of the European research partners, the national research and education networks in Europe, in Western and Central and Eastern Europe, are all there. So it has a very ubiquitous coverage and a very impressive coverage, and also a very global coverage, because it's not just about connections within Europe. It has major connectivity to the rest of the world. Some of this, the most important connectivity in terms of capacity, is to North America, obviously a very advanced research area in its own right, but via additional projects which come from Commission co-funding in the area of aid-related activities, we have important connectivity to Latin America, to the southern Mediterranean, to areas of Asia-Pacific, and most recently to Africa. So it has a pretty good global footprint in terms of supporting research and education. But what I'd like to concentrate on a little bit this afternoon is some of the issues and challenges for this looking ahead. In practice, this type of infrastructure has existed since 1990, and it has developed and evolved very significantly in the last 20 years. But looking ahead, the challenges are very significant. And in particular, we have one of the issues that we face is the question of solidarity and cooperation. Because if you look at the European research area and you look at the overall structure of it, you want it to be inclusive. You want to have, if you like, a universal service obligation. And that is quite an issue in its own right, and it really brings to mind the question of edge versus center. A second point which is important is that this is not just a physical infrastructure providing service. It is also an infrastructure that is providing support for research and whose partners are active in the research area as well. And how this is developed and managed is an important question. Then there is an interesting point about providing service to people. Actually, if you look at the requirements which you see researchers having, they're primarily interested in service. And this is quite a challenge for us to provide uniform service on a pan-European and on a global basis. And there is also an interesting question, which is that you have these separate e-infrastructures. You have a view of grids, you have a view of storage, you have a view of supercomputing, you have potentially some issues coming in the area of clouds, and how do they all fit together with networks? And I think that is a key challenge if you look ahead in the next 7 years. One point which is important to look at is the question of solidarity. And the reason why this is an important question is if you look at the underlying cost of providing such a networking capacity, then the basic element of cost is transmission. And the basic structure of transmission costs is they are low incremental costs, but high initial costs. And so the bigger the volumes, the smaller the average cost that you're going to face in terms of providing service. Now, if you're in the center of the network, this is really rather nice because the edge of a network contributes to the traffic in the center. But if you're at the edge of a network, you face the problem that actually it's not quite like that. And you can see, looking at this picture of two routes in the network, Dublin to London and Frankfurt to Geneva, that as far as Dublin to London is concerned, any investment in Dublin to London will only be amortized over 2 wavelengths, whereas Frankfurt to Geneva, partly because of the presence of the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, sees a lot more traffic, and so the cost of that infrastructure there is amortized over a very significantly larger number of amount of capacity, and so is proportionately cheaper. And this is a general issue in terms of what you might call the edge versus the center. And actually, if you want to have a pan-European capability with a universal service obligation, you have to look at the way the money flows in order to make sure that this difference, which is a very real economic difference, is not one that affects the provision of service. Now, one of the other points which is important is the question of research versus infrastructure. GÉANT is primarily providing a physical infrastructure. It's an advanced infrastructure, but it's a service-based infrastructure. But in parallel with that, both GÉANT and the participant research networks are active in research in their own right. And so there are areas of network monitoring, there are areas of management and control that are elements of the GÉANT program. And in terms of our attitude to intellectual property rights, we have a very inclusive approach. We have a very open approach to licensing. But if you look at our level of cooperation with industry, I think it's fair to say that these are historically have been parallel worlds, that there is research in industry and there is research in research networking, and they don't really coordinate or develop as much in common as one would like. So this is certainly a challenge looking ahead. It's a challenge that has been recognized, and it's a challenge where we are attempting to put more effort in building a bridge. But there is certainly one obstacle, and that is the fact that all of this network is required via competitive procurement. And if you're looking at competitive procurement in Europe, and you're looking at the sort of rules that govern competitive procurement, you face the very practical challenge that it keeps you very much at arm's length from the suppliers with whom you would actually like to cooperate to a very reasonable extent. And so competitive procurement is a necessary feature, but in practice it does act as an inhibitor in terms of, for example, research cooperation, because you can't really combine research cooperation and competitive procurement. It doesn't function particularly well. The third challenge, which I think is important, is creating the service culture. Now, if you look at the development of research networking, if you actually look at the development of the internet in Europe over the last 20 years, then what the internet did, which didn't exist previously, was it provided ubiquitous networking capabilities. The service might have been rubbish, but if you weren't used to a service beforehand, the existence of a new service, the existence for the first time of networking capability, which really only started in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was a tremendous step forward. If you had nothing before, you were impressed by having something, even though it wasn't necessarily very good. And that sort of attitude in the context of internet developments is something that is still quite technical. And so I think it's fair to say that as far as research networking is concerned, we have been really rather good delivering technology to technologists. But we need to become a lot better at delivering service to human beings, because although a significant element of our constituency is technology and technology-driven, that ignores the fact that there are latent users there who will be put off by the lack of service support. It also ignores the fact that actually what people really want is service, and they don't necessarily want to have to solve their own technical problems. So one of the things which we're concentrating on now is providing newer user groups with longer-term help and support, because that's what they need in order to be able to utilize this technology. With the best will in the world, advanced network technology, advanced computer technology is not plug and play. If it's difficult to switch between two Macintoshes in a fairly limited context here, you can imagine that trying to use an advanced network resource, trying to marry it to advanced computer resources has its own issues and challenges. And an emphasis on service as opposed to technology is the way of resolving this problem. The next point, which I think is important, is what I've described here as the convergence of e-infrastructures. It's a term that has a currency. E-infrastructures is a term that has a currency which is probably about 5, maybe 10 years old at most. And it's a very reasonable term to use. But if I look at the elements in parallel, you can see grids, and you've heard an interesting presentation on grids from Steve Newhouse of EGI. We've looked at supercomputing. There isn't storage on the agenda directly today, but it's certainly a significant element of the infrastructure. Future internet technology is something that exists in parallel, and you have Géant. Now, all of these exist. They all cooperate at some level. But what is lacking on a European level, what exists in a number of countries nationally, is a common focus as to how these might operate together. And I think that's another of the challenges which I see. So to summarize what I think are the issues looking ahead, co-funding, the European Union funding elements of infrastructure is vital for true European access. Without European Commission co-funding, the center part of the network would exist anyway. It is cheap enough to be able to achieve without European funding. But if you want a truly European access, if you want Ireland, if you want Portugal, if you want some of the countries that are at the edge to be participants in this, and participants on an equal basis to the more privileged geographically located countries, then that European co-funding is what makes the difference. It means that you don't have to pay significantly more in Ireland or in Portugal or in the geographically disadvantaged countries. And I think that's an important lesson looking ahead. You can build a research network, and you can build a large and powerful research network, but you won't build it everywhere. If you look at what's happened in the United States, I think the United States network has something like 10 nodes on it for the entire United States. We have 40 nodes. And I think that says quite a lot about the importance of making sure that you have a universal service obligation. The second point, and this is one where I think we need to dwell a little bit more in practice, is we need real cooperation on research. We're not quite getting the synergies between the work that's being done in the research networking environment and the work that's being done in other areas of the framework of the 7th framework program in the context of ICT. That, I think, is a challenge for us all. The third point is that if you look at what the fundamental issues are about, it is about providing service to users. Yes, technology plays a part in that, but the technology is effectively a global capability, and technology research is a very relevant area in its own right, as you heard from the previous speaker. But in terms of this type of e-infrastructures, it's about providing service to people. It's not about providing technology to people. And so it's users' needs that should drive the direction we're going in. And the final point that I want to make, and this is really a policy question, is will there be a joined-up approach to e-infrastructures, or will they continue to coexist as a set of parallel activities with cloud computing sitting somewhere on the side? Now, that will continue to work, but I think there are opportunities to be had by taking a more pan-European approach to all of these infrastructures together. Thank you.